There's a couple different ways that we can measure gross domestic product. One is the expenditure approach. Whenever we make a purchase, that is through the expenditure approach, but we could also measure it through the income approach. We're going to focus on the expenditure approach, but just to understand that whenever we buy something, we create income for somebody else. So if I go buy a gallon of gas today, then that's an expenditure, but then the gas station has income. So we could measure it either way, but we're going to focus on the expenditure approach. We're going to use this formula a lot. So get used to it. So GDP is going to be C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So C is consumption, I is investment, G is government purchases, X is exports, M is imports. I know exports doesn't start with an X and M is not the beginning of imports, but that's what we use. Okay, so let's talk about what consumption is. Consumption is when households purchase goods and services. So when I go to the grocery store, when I buy a car, when I buy whatever, I get my hair cut, all of those things are consumption. So it's households purchasing goods and services. Investment, we have three components to investment. One is when firms purchase physical capital. We've learned about physical capital before. Those are the machines, tools, equipment that we use to produce other things. So, for example, McDonald's purchases a machine that pours drinks. Okay, that's a piece of capital. Okay, physical capital. So, whenever we buy any sort of tool that creates other things, that's physical capital for firms. Also, if we add to inventory, so in my example here, let's say Ford builds $10 billion worth of cars this year, but we only buy $9 billion worth of them. So there's $1 billion worth of cars that they built but weren't sold. But we're measuring production, remember, so we want to count them in there. So if we have built them but we haven't sold them yet, we count that as investment. And then new home construction counts in investment. So even though it sounds like it might be in consumption because it's for households, but we count new home construction under investment. Okay, so government purchases is when the government purchases final goods and services, and that's for all three levels of government, federal, state, and local governments. So one thing we need to note here is transfer payments aren't going to count. What a transfer payment is when the government takes money from one group and gives it to the other, and the group that's receiving the money does not have to do anything to receive that money. There's no exchange of goods and services. So for example, Social Security, if you have a job, they're going to take out 6.2% of your income and put it into this Social Security pot of money. And then your employer is also going to contribute 6.2% of your money into this pot of money. But that money is not just going into an account for you. That money is going to pay people that are currently retired. So you're taking money from one group, giving it to another group. There's no production involved. So that's not counted in GDPs. Other examples would be unemployment benefits, welfare, VA benefits. None of those, the stimulus package payments that we got during COVID, again, the government's just taking money from one group and giving it to another group. There's no production involved, so we don't count those in government purchases or GDP. So we also have exports and imports. Exports are when we produce something in this country, but somebody purchases it in another country. So for example, if we produce planes and somebody in Mexico buys a plane from somebody or a plane that we produce in the United States, that's an export. So imports are goods produced in another country but purchased here. So if we purchase pineapples from Costa Rica, then that is an import. It was produced somewhere else, but we purchase it here. So if we take export minus imports, then that is going to be what we call net exports. Okay, so net exports would be exports minus imports. So if exports are 25 billion and imports are 22 billion, we do 25 billion minus 22 billion. So net exports would be 3 billion. But in our country, exports are always less than imports. So in this case, 45 billion, imports 55 billion. So net exports would be negative 10 billion. These are not US figures. I made these up. So those are the components of GDP.